Hello and welcome back to Gillityr Games. We are in Satisfactory, and today I am happy to announce that the oil rigs that you see back in the distance, not the little models in the foreground here, but the actual oil rig blueprints are now available on Satisfactory Calculator's website. And I'll provide a link in the video text description down below. But what I wanted to do for this video was just kind of help you understand how to put them together. These are modular blueprints, and you can build a variety of different oil processing plants or offshore oil rigs with a variety of different approaches and final product output. And I have made multiple small models that we're going to be going over. Well, some models aren't exactly small, but we're going to talk about what you can actually build with these modules. They are not limited just to the turbo fuel power plants, which you can see off in the distance there, which you've seen in many of my videos, because it was kind of the cornerstone, the meat and potatoes of my power generation through the entire mid-game playthrough that I've been working on. But there's other options too. Options are more available early in the game, and those that are, well, much more later in the game. I do not claim that I have covered all needs of oil processing with these blueprints. This is just the bulk and the heart and soul of what you will need to really get going with kind of building these offshore oil rigs. If you are not aware, let me just jump into delete mode and blueprint mode. You can see when I highlight this to delete it, that is a blueprint. It is a 12 by 12 foundation by 10 meters high, and this is kind of what I'm talking about. There's multiple different blueprints that are available now, including the footing and all the different refineries, and also a fuel generator blueprint, which you can see up there on top. I'm not going to get into great detail on how to do the individual connections, but just know that electrical's already run. All your piping all lines up, so you just have to do little connector pipes and then make one little jump for your electrical. Same for when going up. It's fairly easy to connect those locations. You might have to do some reworks here and there, based on your needs and your desires, but this is going to give you a huge jump start in building a power plant that at least I feel looks pretty decent. There are other videos on my channel that you can find that go into more detail and show you where those connections are for some of these components. And based on response, if there's need for me to dive into, making a video for each individual blueprint and really go into a great detail, I will. But for now, the channel's pretty small and there's not a lot of subscribers, so I want to be careful how much work I apply to that. So, with that said, let's get started on this first model, and I can talk about how this all works. So as I mentioned, I built these models, and the concept here is that each one of these, it's a foundation block, pretty obviously, but each one of these foundation blocks actually represents an entire blueprint, an entire 12 by 12 refinery blueprint that you piece together. They are modular. And so I've colored them based on primarily what the equipment on each blueprint is colored, so that you can kind of see. This residual plastic module in the model represents that residual plastic refinery. This fuel refinery here in the orange represents that orange refinery right there. On top we have fuel generators, 18 fuel generators all on a single blueprint, and that's what we're talking about up there. So this model represents this real, if you will, virtual construction. The little legs on the bottom, that is just representing our footings that you can see right out there. That little footing assembly, which is also a blueprint available for use. The turquoise on the bottom is just representing the water. So let's talk about this first model, and I built one, a real one in the background there, and that is operational. This is kind of meant to be the earliest oil processing that you may actually get into, where you have just the basic recipe for fuel, and you can process, oil into fuel and put it into some generators and get some power out of it. The residual plastic, refinery on the right is optional. In fact, the blueprint for the fuel generator, because they output polymer resin, you can see here, as kind of a byproduct of creating fuel, there's a sink already located on the blueprint. And just this once, I will zoom up there so you can see it. It's right here. You can see there's the awesome sink already in place. So if you're not going to use the polymer resin and process it into plastic, you can just not put this entire blueprint in place, and this smart splitter will automatically send all that polymer resin straight into the awesome sink, leaving you with a very, very simple 2 blueprint or 3 blueprint, counting the footing setup, and just wiring that all together and plumbing in the oil. It also prevents the need for having to pipe in water. You really have to ask yourself, is it worth it for the extra materials and effort and space to get that roughly 100 plastic per minute? And you can make that decision for yourself. But that's the result if you do add the module. And this module, this residual plastic module, is used elsewhere as well. So let's talk about some of the numbers real quick. This particular model actually takes in a full 600 oil per minute. That means a full pure node, a regular node, not a fracking node, and produces 400 fuel per minute. That 400 fuel, if fed into 18 fuel generators, they burn 20 oil per minute. That's what this is all about. That's our fuel burn rate, and 18 fuel generators will give us 4,500 megawatts of power. Now, there's a little extra on this. It could actually satisfy 20 fuel generators, but I personally don't feel that it's worth it slapping an entire blueprint on here of another 18 fuel generators just to use 2 of them. Especially since this is not a terribly efficient way to burn oil. The alt recipes and the other fuel types are simply superior, and you can get to them fairly quickly. But if you need some power and you're just coming from coal, and you don't want to have to build another coal power plant, but you have access to oil, you're into tier 6, let's say, even 5, I think, is when you get access to your first oil refining. You can get away with doing this and really boost your power, maybe temporarily, while you're waiting to get to those other recipes and access to other capabilities. But this is the start. Okay, so I want you to keep in mind 600 oil being converted into 4,500 megawatts. We're going to keep coming back to this. We're going to talk about why the different fluids are more efficient, less efficient, and why, and what all that looks like. So let's take a look at the next reasonable step. Now, these are not, I want to make it clear that these models are just possible configurations of these blueprints. There are lots of other combinations and rearranging them differently and different things you can do. There's also other fuel recipes. I'm not going to present them all here. I'm going to present the ones I use. And in fact, let me just go ahead and state that I actually will never use one of these. The reason I don't is simply because it's not enough of a jump to be worth my time. I pretty much suffer with coal until I get to turbo fuel. That has been how I've played through the last few playthroughs, because the power per oil basically is so much more efficient that is my next step. Now, I will not say that that's the only way, and in fact, now with 1.0, there's some changes that have made me alter my plans for future playthroughs. I still won't use regular fuel, but I will use this next one, and let's talk about why. Now, this particular model is all about an alternate recipe called diluted fuel and another alternate recipe called heavy oil residue. Used together, along with a whole lot of water, takes our oil and makes it a lot more efficient. If we just look at this model head on, you can see there's actually 2 fuel generator modules on the top, but the reality is it's 2 units deep. So this is a 4x4 module structure because this heavy oil residue pulls in 300 oil, produces 400 heavy oil, which you then put into your alternate diluted fuel recipe, and you get out 800 fuel. So the recipe is just called diluted fuel, but you get fuel just like you do in that previous model that we looked at. So we have taken now half as much oil and turned it into twice as much fuel. So what that means is ultimately 4 times as much fuel from the same pure node we were talking about of 600 oil. We'll feed 300 oil into this side and 300 oil into the back there where there's another heavy oil residue module right back there. And we'll lay it out just like this. So we've got kind of 4 modules laid out in a cube. And then we'll put 4 fuel generator modules on the top. That means 9,000 megawatts per side for a total of 18,000 megawatts for 600 oil. So I'll say that again, 18,000 megawatts for 600 oil. Over here, what were we doing? 600 oil, we were only getting 4,500 megawatts. So you can see just from using a couple of alt recipes and a little bit more of a more complicated layout, we're still doing the same burn rate. It's still the same kind of fuel. We're still consuming 20 per minute per generator. We're still getting 4,500 megawatts out of each fuel generator module, but we can use 4 of them instead of 1. So with that same pure oil node is giving us 4 times as much power. We still have an output of polymer resin. In fact, we have 2 of them, because remember, we have 2 of these heavy oil residue modules. They produce a slightly different amount of polymer resin. It's not a lot different. I think it's 67 per module, if I recall, 68. So you can get about 68 plastic out of that. And, sorry, I think those numbers are just off a little bit. We'll see the actual numbers in just a bit on the next model, but I think ultimately you end up with 68 plastic per module is what it is. The polymer resin counts higher, though. Anyway, ultimately, this is just way more efficient. And this is still not the one that, in my most recent playthrough, that I stayed on coal and bypassed both of these, although I did need to get both of these recipes. I waited until I got an alternate for turbo fuel that I really wanted, and I'll show you why in the next one. So this module, in this model, I don't actually have a real world example. I'm really tripping on that. That's a hard thing to say. It's really just, the virtual one, and I've got a model of a model, and this is way too meta. Anyway, so some of the downsides that you have to deal with the diluted fuel recipe is that the throughput gets pretty serious. We're talking about 800 per minute of fuel in a single module, and there's 2 of them. That's 1,600 per minute, but just each side, each module itself at 800 has to actually utilize, and that's kind of why I put double arrows here, has to utilize 2 pipes, because the most capacity we can fit in the pipe that you get in tier, I don't know if it's 6 or 7 off the top of my head, but the Mark II pipes can only handle 600 a minute. So that means we have to have dual outputs on the diluted fuel module. On top of that, we also have to bring in 800 water into this module, broken into 2 pipes for the same reason as the fuel needs. So there's a bit more work to be done here, considering that water extractors on average pull 130 water a minute or whatever it is, somewhere around there. You're going to need like 7 non-overclocked water generators or water extractors just to satisfy this one module. So there's a lot of water. If we look back at the base fuel module, it doesn't even need any water. You only need water input if you're going to use some residual plastic, and you only need 100. So we're getting into larger setups and configurations already. As I mentioned before, I also skipped this approach on my last 2 playthroughs, but with 1.0, this setup actually becomes pretty important for a later discussion. So keep the alternate diluted fuel candy in your head there because there's some stuff that I can show you that gets far more interesting in the future items. So after diluted fuel, the next step up, if you will, is when we talk about the alternate recipe for turbo blend fuel. Personally, I like to look for the efficient recipes and the recipes that aren't terribly complicated to manage. So I built the module only for the alternate turbo blend fuel. I didn't even build a module for regular turbo fuel because I don't feel it's efficient enough to be worth my time to ever use it. However, the alternate turbo blend fuel looks pretty good, and on that module we actually use the alternate diluted fuel just built right within this module. There's a little bit of a need for diluted fuel in the turbo blend blenders, and we also needed petrol coke, which we're already pulling in heavy oil residue, so we can easily generate that all within that same turbo blend fuel module. That's a pretty complex module. It also needs to bring in water and sulfur, so there's a whole lot going on. It's very packed in. There's a whole lot going on within that turbo fuel module. However, we're still using the same heavy oil residue module that we saw previously in the previous model. We're still using the same fuel generators. We are considering using a residual plastic module, and in fact the residual plastic module can actually handle a lot more than just what one heavy oil residue module is outputting in polymer. You get 67 plastic per minute out of each one, but this is doubled up. So there's 2 turbo blend fuel modules, there's 2 heavy oil residue modules, there's only 1 residual plastic, and we'll just route both of the heavy oil modules to this one. And back here, this corner is different. I actually put power storage on one of the corners. And we'll take a look at an example of this model because we have one right there. And we're going to do a quick flyby on that in just a moment. I'm going to talk about this just a bit more. The advantage we have here is that we have a total of 6 generator modules now. All still operating. Remember, a pure node, as I mentioned, will output 600 oil per minute. And each one of these heavy oil residue modules can handle 300. So we consume that full node at 600, and we can actually produce this much per half, 13,000 megawatts per half, or 26,000 megawatts in theory once it's perfectly balanced, which takes a long time, by the way, once you start one of these up. But a single pure node of oil is outputting that much. Now we also have some other inputs. We have water. I basically consider that to be basically free in this setup because you're always going to build these on water as an oil rig configuration. That's where they look best, is somewhere slightly offshore. But we're also consuming sulfur here. We need 195 sulfur per minute per turbo blend fuel module for a total of roughly 400 sulfur. So really just a, we can use a standard node or a pure sulfur node if we're looking at future expansion or some combination there. That sulfur will need to be brought in from somewhere. So you can either run along conveyor, you can bring in a train, you can do it with drones. The important thing to know is that you really need to think about when doing any one of these approaches is you really want to be thinking about your future plans. Are you going to build a turbo fuel module like this, generate 26,000 megawatts from the oil and sulfur, and just never change that recipe, never expand upon that arrangement? Is this your plan? And if it is, you can kind of lock in how you do things, and you have lots more flexibility. But if I plan to take this turbo fuel and turn it into a different fuel type by processing it further once I have access, then it changes the mindset a little bit. Then you might change your mind about how you're going to deliver those materials in there and how much time you're going to invest in setting up that infrastructure. So just keep that in mind. But let's go take a look at this real world example of this whole setup. And I've shown these in at least one of my other videos. This is a turbo blend power plant generating roughly 26,000 megawatts of power. And I try to color code within the blueprints what each machine is outputting, so you can kind of tell, like, these are red, this is very likely turbo fuel. I don't even have to look at the recipes, but if I do, you can see it's generating turbo fuel using the alternate turbo blend fuel. It needs fuel, it needs some heavy oil residue, it needs some sulfur, and some petrol coke. You can see the little petrol coke refineries right here, just making it from our heavy oil. So we lose a little bit of our heavy oil, or purple stuff as I call it, in the petrol coke generation. So this module, instead of outputting 400 turbo fuel, we get 390 turbo fuel out of this, because we're consuming a little bit of that heavy oil and making petrol coke. And then we also have over here, we have to use the alternate diluted fuel recipe, which uses heavy oil and water to produce some fuel, because that fuel is an input for the turbo fuel modules. So this is a real dense, tightly packed blueprint that, like I said, is completely available now for download and use. And you can see our water that we're pulling in down here with the water extractors piped in and running up the footing. You can see there, runs up the footing and up inside the module. So ultimately all we're doing is taking that turbo fuel, going up into the generators and running that across, and then we've duplicated all these modules on the other side, with the exception of the one on the very end. So let's go take a look at that real quick. This is power storage. You'll notice, those of you that are really paying attention will have noticed in the model I actually had residual plastic here and the power module on the other side. They're flip-flopped here. Again, your layout is pretty flexible. These are pluggable modules. As long as you're checking what inputs and outputs you have and satisfying those needs, you can get away with changing the layout in several different ways. So these are all just power storage modules. This particular one is a two-part blueprint. It's kind of the base frame without any power storage units on it, and then a separate blueprint for 16 of the power storage modules at a time. And the reason I did that is because if you were to try and instantiate this blueprint as a whole, it's basically, I'm not going to say impossible, it's just that you would have to have all the upgrades, you'd have to have the depot, you'd have to have a full, all your inventory expansion upgrades. It's just really hard to instantiate that way, and it doesn't grow with you very well. So instead I separated it so you can start out by just putting the main 2-deck blank in place, and then maybe just start with one power module, which will give you a couple of minutes of power savings. Should something go wrong, it'll help, you know, fill in that gap while you're figuring out what happened, until you can actually manage to populate it. It takes a lot of copper to make these, by the way. That's the biggest concern, copper and crystal from the lights and all that. But once you have it fully filled in, you have 128 power storage modules, and that creates a very big amount of power storage. As you can see here, I won't get into the gory details. I cover this in some other video, but it's a lot of power storage. And then over here, we have our residual plastic refinery. And we can see that right now, there's also a sink on the residual plastic side. So if you're not consuming that plastic and doing something with it, it will still sink. The reason that there are sinks on both the polymer output and on the plastic is because you don't ever want those two to back up. It will stop your fuel production if it completely fills all the conveyors and it can't output them, and ultimately stop your power plant. So for power, using those sinks is very, very important. You can see here, here's the polymer resin. The plastic refinery is not completely keeping up. And actually it looks like it's probably some conveyance that would use for some updates, but it gives us in a quick visual glance, we can look at it and see if everything is keeping up with that processing. And in this case we're not, so we need to take a look at that and maybe upgrade a conveyor or something. Very easy to manage. Also within these units, anywhere where we are either producing or for the first time bringing in a new material, like in the case of oil, there are tanks used as buffers, so we can see if the buffers are full or see if we're consuming everything that's available. We can see there the heavy oil is doing fine. We can see we're consuming all of our turbo fuel, and we have just barely any kind of containment, which is great. Here's water, we can check that, and then we can also check our fuel, which is used in the turbo fuel blend. So these tanks provide a quick way to take a peek at what's going on within the facility, and we can tell what's going on. Okay, so that's a quick overview. Just wanted to show what some of these modules look like. You can see here the fuel generators. It's just 18 fuel generators packed in with some nice catwalks, so you can walk around. Obviously right now I am in fly mode, just so that I can do this video without having to take 25 minutes to climb into one of these. It's no joke. These things are massive. So walking around, it's pretty easy to get actually lost in one of these facilities if you're walking on the ground. Just be aware of that. You may also notice some of these generators are not running, and that's just simply because the way this one is configured, we really could shut off a couple of generators and try and consume the exact amount. I prefer just to have generators available to take those last bits of fuel and surge, and just knowing that a couple will turn on and off every now and then, no big deal to me. Being able to produce a power plant of this size and complexity quickly with the blueprints is more important to me than having perfect ratios, at least when it comes to power generation. You are welcome, of course, however, to lay one of those out. You can turn off generators if they're not in use, or alter the ratios. You can use overclocking or underclocking to your heart's desire. So that's the turbo fuel module, and this is the one that I tend to race towards on my previous playthroughs. I go from coal straight to one of these, and it's a hard leap to make, and it does take a lot of effort. You got to build up a lot of materials. It takes a lot of steel. It takes a lot of rotors and motors and all the other parts and pieces needed. But what I will do is I will create only half of it, and in fact only one fuel generator module, and I'll get the whole thing running just piped to one generator module, and then I will slowly add the others. Another trick you can do too is you can take power storage module if you're having a hard time, because every one of these modules has equipment in it. Blenders, refineries, pumps, lights, all those different things. First of all, just turn the lights off if you're real tight on power trying to get one of these started. But the other things that you can do if you just don't have enough power to kickstart the whole operation is put in some power storage somewhere temporarily on your power grid. Let that power storage build up, and then maybe you can get past any hurdle that you may have of needing a bit of a time to get things running, because it does take a lot. You can also individually just go in and turn off some of the equipment, leave one of each running, just so that you can get some little bit of fuel going and let some generators sip off of just one blender. Right, that's another trick that you can do, and then slowly power everything on. Another quick note I will talk about, though. Let's see. Let's go over here. Every one of these has power switches inside, so that you can turn off the equipment, or you can turn off the lights separately, so you have a little bit of control there. But all the circuit breakers can be configured based on their names, and you can set up priority groups and priority switches so that if power fails in any particular way, it will fail cleanly. For example, it will first fail lights, then it's going to take off TUB is power, the little transport tubes, hyper tubes. Then it'll start taking out regular factory equipment not related to power. And then factory drones go down, and then full factory mains turn down. Then it gets to equipment used for power generation, and finally the power generators and storage themselves. So these priority groups really do help if you spend a little time organizing these. I am currently in, this is kind of what I call just a design center playthrough, where everything's all about just being able to make these videos, so various stages set up. It's not a real playthrough. That's in a different save. But so you might not see as many of those circuit breakers as you would see in a full playthrough. So that is the turbo fuel, the alternate turbo blend fuel module setup, and how I recommend laying out those modules. One other quick note, when 1.0 first came out, some of my blueprints were not snapping together well in blueprint mode. When you create them, there were gaps and offsets and misalignments. Something changed in 1.0, so I had to just redo a few things in some of those blueprints. It's one of the reasons I was waiting to release these. That should all be fixed now. That's the great news. So you can piece together those blueprints quite easily now for all these different modules. Okay, so we just talked about turbo fuel, but I just want to drop back over here real quick and remind you about the alternate diluted fuel recipe and just how much diluted fuel we get from that setup. From the same amount of oil, I want to go over here and look at this absolute monstrosity. Now, after I built this model, I realized I would never build an actual power plant this way. It just simply requires too many power generators to be reasonable. You could build this hulking monstrosity. It is absolutely enormous. I mean, the model is even huge. But let's talk about what it is first before we worry about how large it is, because there's going to be a way I'm going to show you to get around that. The burn rate on rocket fuel is 4.2. Roughly, it's like 4.167, I think it is. Which means the fuel generators still produce always 250 megawatts of power per generator if they're not overclocked, just at their base configuration. But it burns a lot less fuel using rocket fuel. This example is using an alternate recipe called Nitro rocket fuel. Still produces the same output of rocket fuel, but the recipe is different than the regular rocket fuel recipe. If combined with the alternate diluted fuel, which we talked about earlier, where we make 800 fuel per 300 oil, right? Same thing as the previous model. We're just taking that diluted fuel now, we're pushing it into a alternate nitro rocket fuel module that produces 1,200 rocket fuel and only burns at 4.2 per minute. Now, you don't have to do all that math in your head, because I've kind of already figured all that out, but just know that we're producing more fuel and the output is even higher. Okay? In fact, half. This is just half. This is one of each of these modules, and half of all of the fuel generators you see on the top generates 72,000 megawatts of power, and we are still only using a half of a pure oil node. We combine two halves of that, and yes, it's 144,000 megawatts or 144 gigawatts of power. Some downsides. We talked about the diluted fuel and how it needs a whole lot of water, how you have to have a two-pipe system. That's all taken care of in the module, the blueprint that's already available. You do have to do the water part. Can't really easily blueprint that. Water extractors don't play nice with blueprints, in my experience. So you'll have to do the water extractors. The nitro rocket fuel alternate needs 800 sulfur and 400 coal and 600 nitrogen gas. Remember, that's per half. So you have two halves taking in all those materials. But the output on the power generation is much, much, much higher, to the point where even a turbo fuel module at 26,000, right? It's double that, 26,000. This is still almost, well, it's 3 times as much on a half of it. So the amount of power generation potential here is enormous when using rocket fuel. Now, I didn't like the base rocket fuel recipe, so I didn't even bother to create a base rocket fuel module either. I went straight to nitro rocket fuel. It's the only one that makes sense. But this is just huge. And quite frankly, trying to balance the pipe system, you'd have 4 separate pipe systems because you have 2 pipes of rocket fuel coming out at 600 per minute each pipe maximized. you would have to route that through the half of these systems or a quarter of these systems and do that 4 times. So it's going to take a lot of work to get this, not to mention just the sheer amount of materials to make all those fuel generators. This is also kind of a, I'll call it an endgame recipe. I know nuclear is beyond this, but quite frankly, if you build one of these, you don't need nuclear. Just not necessary. At worst, we build 2 of these. But I don't like this configuration. So I then thought that, you know what, now is probably time, because at this point in the game, you're going to have several hundred overclocking. Darn it, I forgot what they're called. There's these the little things that you put in for overclocking. Let's go take a look. Just want to look at this. Completely forgot what these things are called. Power shards. You put power shards in here, and you can overclock various pieces of equipment. In this case, this is probably an opportunity for overclocking to make this more reasonable. Even though it will take a lot of power shards, it's still worthwhile. Take a look at this layout. Now, I actually put this in backwards, so we're going to fix that real quick. My apologies on that. I have... Luckily, these guys are all set up as... These little models are set up blueprinted as well. Alright. So now we should have our information on the face. There we are. This is the same as this unit. The only difference is we're going to take and put 2 power shards in every single fuel generator. Yes, hundreds of power shards. Not to put too many spoilers out there, but ultimately you will get the ability to create synthetic power shards. This is a non-issue. At the point in the game where you're considering rocket fuel usage, you will have enough power shards. And you don't have to put them in right away. You can just build this rocket fuel system. Don't put the power shards right away in every generator, but you still generate more power than that turbo fuel power plant from the same amount of oil. You're just using a lot more sulfur, and you're also adding coal and nitrogen gas. And then you can plug those power shards in afterwards until you manage to fill out the full facility. When you do put 2 power shards in and you crank up the fuel generator to 200%, then we also consume twice as much fuel per minute. And that's exactly what we wanted in this case, to reduce the footprint and the overall cost of all the materials to create all the generators. Advantage is that it generates twice as much power. So you get 9,000 megawatts out of each module instead of the 4,500, which just results in the same amount of total power. Remember, this is only half. Just half of this generates 72,000, 144,000 megawatts of power from this. Now, I mentioned earlier how my past few playthroughs prior to 1.0, in early access, that I would not build either of these. I would just use coal until I could get here to turbo fuel, and until I had the alternate recipes necessary to go straight to turbo fuel. And I can tell you that I had to build 4 of these roughly for my needs. Some for drone fuel now, and some for power in the latest playthrough, because now drones can also be powered through these. So, there's a different approach now, though. A different path, if you will, that you could take. On my next playthrough, what I intend to do is stop from coal, go to diluted fuel, which is an easier jump than coal to turbo fuel. Go to diluted fuel, and then while I have this, if you notice, going heavy oil into diluted fuel and some power generators on top, it's the exact same layout. So now I can just add a nitro rocket fuel, reroute the diluted fuel, and just add more generators to the exact same installation and grow that power plant into a rocket fuel power plant from diluted fuel, skipping turbo fuel entirely. So that is most likely my plan for my next playthrough. At this point, again, this is just a test environment here, but in my actual 1.0 playthrough, I've already committed to turbo fuel, and I have three of them for power generation running turbo fuel, exactly like that configuration you see in the distance. And then I have a fourth that I'm using for drone fuel. So I'm a little heavily invested into my current configuration, and I did think about, could I swap this out one at a time maybe? And I could, but it's a lot of effort, and quite frankly, I don't even need it. I don't need that much power. I have a lot of power in that particular environment, so I'm not worried about it yet. And I might play with nuclear if I ever do need more power, but I don't think I will. But this transition from diluted fuel into rocket fuel looks very smooth if you take that as a possible route. Anyway, that's just some thinking out loud. I hope these models helped you understand, how you can piece together these blueprints and actually make, an offshore oil rig or many offshore oil rigs. Areas that I recommend for using these modules, this is what is referred to by some as the Golden Coast or the Gold Coast. There's a whole lot of oil nodes out here, several pure nodes. There's a fracking area as well. It can support probably 5-6 of these turbo fuel power plants if you wanted to. You only need really one pure node if you're going to go the rocket fuel route, and you'll just get a tremendous amount of power there. And getting coal here is easy. Coal is all over the place. Sulfur, even if you take and make a full-blown nitro rocket fuel setup, you need 800 sulfur aside, 1600 conveniently enough. That is about as much as a pure and a medium node of sulfur are going to be able to produce for you. And right inland, just a little ways, you'll find one of each. And so everything is right here on the coast that you would need to set yourself up with a nitro rocket fuel refinery. So that's something to definitely consider. I can say that you can also build one of these out in an area. I forget what it's actually referred to. I call it Candy Cane Lake because a lot of the flowers there look like candy canes, or a lot of the plants, I should say. If you know, then you know. And then also in the very north central coast, there's another area with a whole lot of oil up there. You could build any one of these up there as well. But again, you could also build it on land and just bring in your water from a fracking node or some other location like that, or train it in however you wanted to do it. I just think that these modules look better when set up as an offshore oil rig. You're welcome to do whatever you want with them, though. Blueprints are all available. Have fun with them. If there tends to be a large demand for more information, I'll put out some more videos further explaining some of this. Between this video and the previous, I think you'll have enough information to utilize these modules. If you have any trouble, of course, throw it in the comments. I'll be happy to answer and help anyone out who's thinking about using these modules. Thanks for watching.